Today's scripture reading is from John chapter 13, verse 1 through to 17. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated, everyone. All right. Hey, this Sunday actually marks the first Sunday as we lead towards this season where Christians around the world actually commemorate this season called Lent. Now, Lent is actually the season that starts with Ash Wednesday, which was this past Wednesday, and it leads up until Holy Week and then, of course, Easter Sunday, which is the resurrection. Now, this season is a season in which most people kind of around the world, and maybe you're not even a Christian here, but you've probably heard of this idea or this habit, for instance, of during Lent, we fast things like chocolate or red meat or things like that in order that somehow we might center ourselves on the person of Jesus, especially as we lead towards Holy Week. Now, for us during the season of Lent as a church community, we'll actually be continuing in the Gospel of John, gospel account being like this historical account of the person of Jesus. Because what's unique about the Gospel of John is that 4 whole chapters are actually devoted towards Jesus during the Last Supper. Now, the Last Supper, for those of you who aren't Christians here, the Last Supper is actually, you may have seen it in different paintings or different ways in which people have talked about the Last Supper. It's Jesus' last meal that he has with his disciples before he goes to his eventual death. And what's so interesting about the Gospel of John is there's a significant portion of these chapters are devoted to exploring what happens during the Last Supper. And so today actually begins the passage that was just read for us about what Jesus does as he has and engages in this Last Supper meal with his disciples, which again is this historical event that happened as Jesus leads the people. Now notice how it begins. Look at what it says. It says, "It was just before the Passover festival." Now the Passover festival was this time in the Jewish calendar in which people would remember Passover, this seminal moment in the history of the people of Israel in which they would be delivered from Egypt. And so during the Passover festival that's happening, this is also the time in which Jesus ends up dying and Holy Week happens. Now look at what it says. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world. Now, in other words, Jesus already, John is actually cluing us in. Jesus has already been sharing little breadcrumbs about how Jesus predicts the fact that he's going to die. Now, most people, they're so stunned by this, they don't even know what he's talking about. Because here he is, he'd be talking about his death. And most people are like, wait a minute, you're talking about death? You just brought Lazarus back from life. Like, listen, Jesus, you're going to be okay. You know, you just fed 5,000 people. You'll be all right, Jesus. Now, but Jesus is constantly talking about his death. Most people didn't quite get it or understand or listen in. But Jesus, though, the text actually tells us he knows that the end is near. So what happens is It says, and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. I mean, I love that phrase. In other words, he's got such affection for his disciples and his followers. He knows that he's about to go to his pending death. And now what we're going to see is like the greatest fulfillment, the extent of his love for his disciples is about to be demonstrated. Now, look at what it says. It says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas. Now, Judas, of course, in the historical account, is someone that would betray Jesus. And the son of Simon Iscariot to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things, can I hear you say all things? That's right, not just some things, not just a few things, but actually had put all things under his power. Jesus has all the power. So all these different stories that you've seen throughout the Gospel of John, all these miracles of opening the eyes of the man born blind, all the miracles of walking on water, feeding the 5,000, raising Lazarus from the dead. Like, could you imagine this kind of explosive power? Like the listener who's been following along with these stories of Jesus, they're like, oh my goodness, this cat is powerful. He's got so much dynamic power to him. And notice what it says. It says that all things are under his power and that he had come from God, which again, this is what Christians believe, that Jesus is actually God in the flesh, God the Son. He'd come from God and was returning to God. So you get this? Like, you get what John is basically trying to do. He's capturing this moment. He's basically like, listen, Jesus is near his death, but here's what you're going to see in this passage. The story that I'm about to tell you, it's going to show you the full extent of his love. Like his amazing love. And it's going to show the extent of how all things, every single thing is under him, is under his power. He's got the most dynamic, explosive power. Power over nature. Power over even death. He's got power over any kind of sickness. And look at what it says. Because of this, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. What? After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, like, wait, this is not how the story is supposed to go. Jesus, like, listen, this is what you're supposed to do. Because the full extent of your love, and you're the most powerful person on the planet, this is what you're supposed to do, Jesus. After we've established that you're the most loving and that you're the most powerful, it's supposed to be like, so you got up, snapped your finger, and every single disciple became a billionaire. That's what you're supposed to do, Jesus. You're supposed to leverage all of your power so that somehow each of your disciples can flourish in the ways of the world. That's not what it says. Wait, the full extent of your love, the full extent of your power. This is what you're supposed to do, Jesus. So this is what's going to happen. So you get up, you snap your finger, and every illness and every sickness is seized. Like, that's what you're supposed to do, Jesus. To show us the full extent of your love and your power. Come on, Jesus. I know you can do this. But no. The full extent of his love, all things under his power. And so he gets up, takes off his outer garment, wraps it around his waist, gets on his knees, and begins to wash the feet of his disciples. Now, you don't even need to be from the ancient world to know like how lowly of a task that was. Because even today, to wash someone's feet, I mean, that seems kind of like, I don't know about that. Well, here's the thing. In the ancient world, this idea of washing feet, of course, like sandals. Could you imagine? Have you ever walked around Manhattan in sandals all day? Think about it. Like even in Manhattan, it gets pretty dirty. But could you imagine like in a dry, arid climate, especially in the ancient world, when Jesus is walking around, people's feet would get incredibly dirty because dirt and the muck and the mire would get all over someone's feet. So the only people who actually would wash the feet of another would have to be a servant or the lowest kind of servant. In other words, it was always a trajectory where the only people that would wash feet were the lowest who would actually wash the feet of those who were higher than them in the social rankings of who mattered the most. Now, here's what's so stunning, right? Wait, if that's the case, then I think shouldn't the disciples be washing Jesus' feet? Or shouldn't the lowliest servant in the room be washing the feet of the teacher and Lord? And the answer to that is, yeah, of course. That's what's customary, especially if you're framing this thing as like, hey, Jesus is going to show the full extent of his love. All power is under his feet. I mean, could you imagine, I was just thinking about New York City. I'm thinking about who are the most powerful people in the city. I think about the richest, the celebrities. I was thinking about the athletes. Baseball season is starting soon. And I was thinking Aaron Judge, who's going to lead the Yankees to a world championship this year. There's who are the most powerful people in our city? Could you imagine? And here, John's writing, he's basically do you see the person who has so much more power than any human that exists, the one who can raise the dead and open the eyes of the blind, this Jesus. And what does it say? What he does, armed with this much power, is he takes a posture that only the lowliest of servants would take. Now, do you see how different this is than the ways of the world, than the ways of our city, which is so power hungry, which is so advancement oriented, which is so much about the more power you amass, then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to leverage that power so that people start to serve you. I mean, isn't that the way of the world and the way of our city? Now, look at what Jesus says. Jesus actually says, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And he asked this question, do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord. In other words, you call me your superior. You call me someone that you're looking up to. But, and rightly so, for that is what I am. It's true. I do have this positional authority. I have this relational authority. I have this real authority, this dynamic power where all things are under my feet. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example, and you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. What? Is this real? Here Jesus is with all the power in the world. Could you imagine? Just think about the billionaires in our city. Just think about the people who have all sorts of political clout or celebrity. And you see that to show the full extent of their love, to show their most incredible dynamic power, what they say is, let me show you the way of power. Let me show you the way of love. And they get down on their knees and they begin to wash the feet of the lowliest of low that we would consider in society. Because that's essentially what Jesus is doing. He begins to humble himself to such a degree. He's the most powerful person in the room, and yet he gets down on his knees and does the lowliest of tasks. Now, this, again, it upends the way that we normally think about power and even love. Jesus is someone that shows that the way of Jesus is actually the way of humble service. And the invitation that Jesus has is, just as I have done this for you, do this for others. That what it means is that in a world that is constantly about self-advancement and self-promotion, what would it look like for us to be a people of incredible humility and service? To take our power and to actually leverage it in a way that would serve others. That we would not consider others to be too menial for us. Now, listen, I was thinking about this, I was trying to think about moments when I have been filled with just kind of, when I feel like I have power, And some of you may or may not know, but our ministry center at the Hub, which is on 31st Street and Park Avenue, our church, we did a fundraising campaign. We raised money to purchase this building. And since then, that building has been used by several different churches within the city and different organizations. And so, that time, Tina and I, we had prayerfully, been part of this whole process of raising money, giving our own financial resources so we could purchase this building. And so, now here's the thing. I actually, my main mode of transportation around the city is often riding a bike. And so when I usually ride a bike, I wear a helmet. And I don't know, there's something about, it's either the way I dress or the way that people perceive me. Because I ride a bike and I wear a helmet, whenever I go to places, I constantly get mistaken for a delivery guy. There's probably some racial profiling there going on as well. But I just want you to know, like, people kind of like, oh, are you like, I'm like, no, I'm not delivering. I'm here for a meeting. But there's just something about me, my look, the fit, whatever. I just, constant delivery guy vibes. So anyhow, here I went back to the hub, which is our church building, which blood, sweat, and tears have gone into purchasing this building, right? So like, I go to the hub, and I rode my bike there, and as I walk in, there's a woman at the door. Now, you gotta understand, this building is often used by different churches and organizations. So this woman, she stops me, she says, oh, like, are you here? Like, we didn't order anything. And as I'm walking in, and she says this to me, I feel this swell of pride and like resentment, and like, she's like, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, and we didn't order anything right now. And I was like, you don't know who I am? I mean, like, you gotta understand, like, I was felt like, just like, and I was like, do you realize, like, I've been here for years. Like, in fact, you're acting like I'm a guest here. You're a guest in this place. Now, I didn't say any of that, but I just want you to know, like, that feeling inside of me of like, oh my, like, do you know who I am? And I realized, like, this feeling of entitlement and power and like self-righteous indignation. And like, it started to swell in me. And I was just thinking, like, something as simple as that is just being asked, like, hey, are you, like, what's your relationship with this place? And I'm like, my relationship? You wouldn't be here if it weren't for me. Like, that's honestly what I felt like saying, what I thought about saying. But as I was just even thinking about that small little kind of affront to my own ego and pride, here Jesus is. Could you imagine? He's got all the power in the world, like all the supernatural, natural power in the world. And here Jesus is, and what he does with that power, he does not leverage it to shame other people. He does not use it to show people how small they are. He actually takes the posture of the lowliest of the low, of the servant that any well-respected person would never take on this kind of task. Now, do you see how stunning this moment is for Jesus to do this? St. Ignatius of Loyola, a Catholic priest who's done a lot of work around discernment and the way that we spiritually approach decision-making and seeing God in everyday life. Ignatius of Loyola would actually talk about these 3 different levels of humility when it comes to the spiritual journey that we're on. Now, as I've been pondering this passage, and as I was thinking myself about the 3 different ways or humility, he talks about, there's this first level of humility. He calls it initial humility, or humility for the sake of salvation. And you know what kind of humility is needed for this first level? It's the humility to say, God, I want to obey you. I trust you. I don't want to obey myself. I want to obey you. So do you understand? So it's this humility that's basically open to the will of God. God, whatever you might will, I will obey you as best as I can. Now, I remember reading that and being like, that's the first level? Like, that seems pretty extreme already. But could you imagine just in your own life, having the kind of humility where you're like, yep, Jesus, I'm going to obey you with my money, with my body, with my career, with my relationships. This is how I'm going to obey you. But there's a second level of humility. And the second level of humility is a humility for a detached life. And what Ignatius talks about is, it's the kind of humility where we've been so humbled that not only are we willing to say, God, I want to obey you, but we're actually willing to say, God, I will obey you in richness or in poverty, in sickness or in health, in any kind of circumstance. Even if it might lead to my own demise and to my own death, I will obey you. It's being detached from any outcome. So in other words, whether I get wealthy or I get impoverished, I will trust you. It's having the kind of humility where I'm so open to the will of God that I will go in either direction. Now, some of you are like, there's another level to that? Now, here's the level, the third level of humility. It's the humility for love of the poor Christ. It's the kind of humility that is so open to the will of God that you would actually choose poverty over wealth. That you would actually choose sickness over health. That you would choose the lowly path over the promotional path. Now, Ignatius is not saying this is the journey that every single one of us are to take. What he's saying is your heart in such a disposition that you're so willing to follow this Jesus, that you're so humbly following after Jesus, that you're willing to say, Jesus, I want to take the path of the impoverished Christ, of the poor Christ. Now, do you see how different this is in the ways of our city? This alpha city, which is so much about power and advancement. Now, again, this is nothing against each one of us having healthy ambition. It's talking about the texture of our lives and the way that we approach Jesus. Are we willing to take a posture of humility that we would say, Jesus, I want to choose you and your will over and against even the conventional ways of thinking about my own life and journey? Do you see what kind of open-handedness there is? Now, this invitation that the way of Jesus is the way of service, again, it goes against every single ways that we think about power and advancement in our city and in our world. And Jesus demonstrates that the way of following him is actually the way of service. Could you imagine what would it look like then in our relationships? You know, so many times, even within the church, there can be discussions of who has the power. Who has the power in a marriage relationship, a man or a woman? Who has the power? I mean, this is what we say. Whose decision, whose power matters more? You know what's so interesting is that Jesus and his disciples at one point, they're like, they see all the miracles that Jesus are doing, and they're basically like, hey, Jesus, a couple of disciples are basically like, Jesus, you know, like, hey, in glory, can we get the right hand? Can we be in those positions of power with you? And then the rest of the disciples, naturally, they start getting, they're like, what are you guys talking about? I can't believe you would do that. Hey, Jesus, can we actually get the right hand? Right? Like, so many of them, it's just scheming for power. I know that never happens in New York. But that was a joke, by the way. No one laughed. I guess it wasn't funny, right? But like, this is what the disciples do. They're basically like vying for power. And you know what Jesus says? He says, not so with you. Because you know what? The rest of the world, it's all about promotion and power. But if you want to be the greatest in my kingdom, be the servant of all. Now, isn't that interesting? Because even in the church, we're like, wait, who has power, though? Who has power in the church? Like between, in a marriage relationship, a husband and wife, who has the power? Well, here's who has the power. It's not even a question of power. It's a question of, can we outserve one another? Can we actually take on the kind of position that we'd want to uplift each other, that we'd want to serve one another more? Now, do you see how topsy-turvy this is? Because the way of Jesus is the way of service. And it gives us such a different window and perspective. Now, I recognize that some of you, maybe you're not a Christian here, you're just like, I don't know if I want to live that way. And it's supposed to be a natural affront to the ways that we think about, the ways that we treat one another. But see, Jesus is not of this world. And what he's introducing us to is a way of life and of service and love that is way different. That is not rooted in entitlement and I'm better than and I can't believe you would do this to me, but instead is rooted in a life of service. But notice what happens in this story, because there's two disciples in particular that are mentioned in this account. Check this out. Look at what it says. It says, he came to Simon Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? I mean, like Peter has this bravado to him, if you know anything about the story of Peter. Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you're going to understand. And look at what Peter says. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Now, Peter was known to be somewhat abrasive and proud. In fact, there's a moment in another scripture where it says that Peter actually turns to Jesus and rebukes Jesus. Could you imagine that? Peter is so proud that he would actually rebuke Jesus. And here in this moment, Peter basically said, no, you shall never wash my feet. And look, Jesus answered him. I could imagine, if I imagine Jesus maybe rolling his eyes. Yeah, probably Jesus doesn't do that because he's not me. But anyhow, I can imagine rolling my eyes at Peter and being like, come on, listen, buddy. You don't know what you're talking about. But look what he says. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Now, Peter's trying to argue with Jesus. He's so proud, he's trying to argue with Jesus. But look at what happens. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. In other words, Jesus entertains this back and forth with Peter, but now he explains to him why you need to wash your feet, which gets so dirty. And look at what he says. And you are clean, though not every one of you. Remember I mentioned there's two disciples that are mentioned. There's Peter, but then there's this disciple, the one who is not clean that Jesus is referring to. Now, who is that? His name is Judas. Judas would end up betraying Jesus. And look what he says, for he knew who was going to betray him. And that's why he said, not everyone was clean. Now, notice, there's two disciples that are talked about. There's Peter, and then there's Judas. Peter is someone who's so proud. He's in this moment where he's basically having this back and forth with Jesus. He's like, no, Jesus, no way you can wash my feet. Now, here's the thing. Some of us, and I can really relate to Peter because I grew up in the kind of culture, the way that my parents would constantly, they would drill into me that I was supposed to be someone who was self-reliant. I don't need anyone's help. I don't need them to do things for me because I've got this. That's how I was raised. In fact, I remember oftentimes in my childhood growing up, feeling like there were all these shame-driven tactics that led me to really resent ever accepting anyone's help. Because honestly, my parents, maybe my dad would leverage that in a manner in which I felt like I owed my dad. So I made a vow that I would not ask people for help. And so I was the kind of person that would just be self-reliant. And what better city to do that than New York City? Because with $2.90, I can get anywhere in the city on my own. Well, I need the MTA, but nonetheless. I mean, isn't that, the city is full of self-reliance and we've got this and I don't need anyone's help. I can do this. And of course, that's why I'm here. Now, here's what happened. I remember as I was dating Tina, and I had a very meager salary working in church ministry. And so, when I was dating Tina, and I would insist upon buying things, and I remember her parents would be like, hey, we'd go out to dinner, and then I would insist on covering the bill. And I would insist on buying the meal, and they'd be like, what are you doing? What? Why do you keep insisting on buying the meal? And then I would be like, no, I got this. Because there was so much pride in me, I got this. I don't need your help. Then I would look at the bill and be like, okay, I got this. And I'd pay for it. And my in-laws ended up telling me, they said, Drew, the more you kept insisting on paying for things and being the person who was trying to take care of us, she said, my mother-in-law said, we want to be more generous to you. And you probably need to learn how to let go of your pride and letting us take care of you. And I remember just being like, what okay, yeah, that was pretty expensive. Yeah, that would be great then. You can pay for whatever you'd like. But I mean, I grew up in the kind of culture where I had to reject, if I walked into their apartment and they're like, hey, do you want a drink of water? I'd be like, no. Even though I'm parched with thirst. I'm like, no. I'm really okay. Then the second time they'd be like, oh, really, are you okay? It's really hot outside. No, I'm okay. I'm totally fine. I self get hydrated. And then a third time, no, are you sure that you, and I'm like, no, I'm okay. I'm really okay. I'm going to go get a cup of water later. And then, but a fourth time, if someone says, hey, are you serious? Okay, I'll be like, okay, maybe if you insist, I'll find it. Yes, but it had to take those 3 or 4 times. That was the culture that I came from, don't ever be reliant on other people. Don't ever receive things from them. And so I can really relate to Peter here. And you can almost see Peter also he's too proud to receive the love of Jesus. Too proud to get washed. Now, you're not going to wash my feet, Jesus. You of all people, you should not wash my feet. And some of you in this room, honestly, you're all pretty proud yourselves. Because you went to these great schools, you've got a lot of money in the bank, you've self-reliant New Yorkers. Maybe some of us were just used to taking care of other people, and so as a result, we're just used to basically, again, being reliant on our own. And so Jesus washing my feet. Come on, Jesus. Like, you can do that for those other people. Maybe churches in the outer boroughs. But in Manhattan, come on, we're like the cream of the crop. Like we've got this, even this following you thing down, and we don't need your love. We don't need like the worst of the worst. Share it with other people first. And what's so stunning is that Jesus actually, like, he insists. He's like, no. Do you see? Like, let me love you. Let me break through some of that self-protective, self-righteous pride that you carry. And will you let me love you and wash you? But I mentioned there's two disciples, right? There's Judas as well. Now, why is it that both of these disciples are actually mentioned here? Now, isn't it interesting that Jesus washes both of their feet, Peter and Judas? And what you may or may not know about the story of Peter is that Peter actually, with all this bravado and pride, he ends up betraying Jesus. He lets Jesus down in Jesus' most important time of need. So here he is. He's like, Jesus, you can't wash me. And like, little does Peter know that just a few hours later, Peter's going to let Jesus down in his most significant moment of need. And yet, Jesus still washes his feet. Now, Judas would actually betray Jesus as well. And you know what's crazy is that Jesus actually washes Judas's feet too. He washes the feet of both of them, Peter and Judas. See, but there's a difference because Judas, if you know anything about the story, he is so saddled with shame. He's so saddled with guilt after he actually betrays Jesus that Judas would actually end up hanging himself. His shame would actually kill him. Now, if you know anything about the story of Peter, there's these moments where he's wailing because he's full of shame as well. He's full of shame. He's betrayed Jesus. And later on in the Gospel of John, we find this story where Jesus actually forgives and restores Peter. See, shame comes upon both Peter and upon Judas, but there's only one person who's willing to receive forgiveness and love, to allow Jesus to actually cover his shame. When we look at the story of Peter and of Judas, only one of them is actually able to say, Jesus, yes, I want to be forgiven by you and I want to receive your love. But the reality is some of us, when it comes down to receiving God's love, we've got too much shame to carry. And honestly, we berate ourselves. We continue to push ourselves towards perfectionism. And as a result, it's not only pride that keeps us from Jesus, it's our own shame. It's all the ways in which we think that we failed and that we don't measure up. It's all the ways in which we keep making mistakes. It's all the ways in which we relapse. It's all the ways in which we think, oh, Jesus, no. Like, I don't know if you want to keep washing my feet. You know, what's interesting is that I was reading this story of this ex-NBA player who was also a college hoop star named Chris Herron. And he's someone that his pro career was cut short because of massive addiction to drugs and alcohol. And he was writing this story as he was on this journey towards sobriety. He writes this story about, or he was sharing in this interview about how as he was in his sobriety, he realized that he was shaving. And as he was shaving, he looked up into the mirror and he looked at his face as he was shaving. And he realized that in the midst of his addictions and relapse, that it had been years since he had actually looked in the mirror and saw his face. He realized there was so much shame that had been part of his life, that had been the impetus for so many of these cycles of addiction and shame and harming himself and harming others. He could never bring himself to just look at himself in a mirror. Maybe there's some of us in this room, when we think about Jesus, we think it's not only pride, it's also shame. Like, we're like, yeah, Jesus, I don't know if you could. I've betrayed you, or there's moments where we're like, Jesus, I don't know, maybe you want to wash other people, but not me, because I'm too far gone. And yet Jesus washes, gets on his knees. Peter's pride continues to erupt, and he gets on his feet and he says, let me love you. Let me wash you. Let me serve you. Peter's like, no. Jesus, no, you don't understand. Like, you're not supposed to do that. And it's like, Jesus is like, no, let me love you. I could imagine he goes one by one and he goes to Judas and he looks him in the eye and he washes his feet. I can imagine Jesus just thinking like, Judas, this shame that you're going to carry, I just want you to know, like, I came to serve you. I came to love you. You can forgive yourself. Some of us in this room, whether it's pride or whether it's shame, what does it look like for you and for me to actually receive the washing love of Jesus? And to let Jesus love you. To receive his love. John Donne, who's an English poet in the 17th century, there's this poem that he wrote that I've grown to love. And it was published posthumously. Now, the thing about John Donne is that John Donne's life was littered with shame and disappointment. In fact, some of his earlier writings before he becomes a Christian is basically a lot of his poems have to do with lust. And he was known as a womanizer. And someone also, when he ends up secretly eloping to marry his wife, his in-laws were so furious and disappointed, he ended up getting imprisoned, and it became this whole spectacle. And then he lived in poverty for much of his life as a result. And John Donne, as I was thinking about him and his own life and all the pain and anguish and shame that he carried throughout his life, and yet he writes this poem that in many ways is autobiographical to his own life and journey. And it's a poem that I've grown to love and come back to time and time again. Because he becomes a Christian, and in his own journey of faith and his own understanding of God and God's love. So I'd like to read this poem to you now. Look at what it says. A hymn to God the Father. He says, "Wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run and do run still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done. For I have more sin. I keep struggling with this thing." Like, what are you going to do? You're going to keep forgiving me? Is that what you're going to be doing? And look at what he writes. "Wilt thou forgive that sin which I have won others to sin and made my sin their door? Will you even forgive the sins in which I've committed where others have sinned as a result of that? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two but wallowed in a score? How about when I relapsed? Will you forgive that sin too? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more." He says, "I have a sin of fear, that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. But swear by thyself that at my death, thy sun shall shine as he shines now, and heretofore. And Jesus, having done that, thou hast done, and I fear no more. That what Jesus has done on my behalf. See, the good news of the Christian faith is not, oh man, I just keep messing up and I don't know if God will forgive me. I don't know if he can cover this shame. I don't know if I keep messing up. And yet the good news of the story of Jesus is Jesus continues to wash and says, will you receive my love? Will you receive my forgiveness? Will you receive my wholeness? And will you know that I'm willing to die for you? That the shame doesn't have to be the end of your story. But you can actually forgive yourself and live into a brand new kind of life.